A bench, a woman, and a silence so heavy it bent the air around her like heat on pavement. She sat still, wrapped in gray, her back straight, her eyes steady, like someone who'd already survived the worst. They didn't cuff her because she resisted. They cuffed her because she didn't flinch. No shouting, no fear. Just silence, calm, controlled, unshakable. The kind of silence that unsettles power, that makes even the confident start to question themselves. Onlookers watched, confused, curious, sensing something deeper than what they were being told. And just before the illusion shattered, a voice slipped through the tension and said, "You really don't know who she is, do you? Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now?" At precisely 7:03 a.m., as the sky above the city bloomed into that pale gray typical of Midwestern mornings in early spring, Evelyn Rhodes stepped through the tall glass doors of the central terminal with the poise of someone who had long since learned the power of presence. The polished marble under her heels echoed softly. With each step she took deliberate and measured, like she had all the time in the world, and no intention of apologizing for it. Her navy blue skirt suit hugged her form just right, clean lines and sharp tailoring, speaking for her before she even opened her mouth. A delicate string of pearls rested gently against the collar of her blouse, not flashy, not loud, but quietly authoritative. Her hair was pinned in a neat chignon, not a strand out of place, not even after the taxi ride from the hotel on 33rd. The train station buzzed around her. Commuters rushed past in a blur of synthetic parkas and styrofoam coffee cups, murmurs of morning chatter blending with the overhead speaker that called for passengers to line up at Gate 9. The smell of stale coffee cleaning chemicals and hot steel lingered faintly in the air. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She walked like the air parted for her, not because it owed her anything, but because she didn't expect it to. She wasn't there to draw attention, and yet people noticed, just not in the way they should have. Eyes followed her from behind newspapers and over the rims of travel mugs, brief glances laced with curiosity, judgment, and something colder underneath. She felt it like static in the atmosphere, that sense that she didn't quite fit the unspoken picture of who usually passed through first-class boarding. She paused briefly near the departure screen, adjusted her leather tote on her shoulder, and glanced up at the digital schedule without turning her head. There it was, Train 222, Washington, D.C., departure time 7:49, platform assigned 11. Her fingers tightened just slightly around the handle of her bag, not from nerves but habit. Even after all these years, all the rooms she had sat in, all the names she had answered to professor, director, advisor, there was still that quiet calculation every time she moved through a public space alone. She had learned to anticipate doubt before it arrived, to see the pattern before it unfolded. "Morning, ma'am. You lost?" A voice cut through the clamor, friendly on the surface, but tinged with something she couldn't quite ignore. A white man in a station uniform, mid-40s, thinning hair under his cap, stood a few feet away, one hand resting lightly on the holster at his side. Evelyn turned slowly, offered a calm nod, and replied, "Number," just confirming the platform number. She didn't smile, but she wasn't rude. Politeness, she had found, could be a double-edged sword when wielded by the wrong person. The man looked her up and down, quick-practiced, and then gave a tight, skeptical nod before stepping away without another word. Evelyn exhaled through her nose and continued toward the private boarding lounge, her steps never faltering but her heartbeat rising just slightly. She could already feel the temperature of the space shifting as she moved deeper into the terminal, as if her presence created an invisible ripple through a current of assumptions and expectations. It wasn't new, but it never stopped stinging in small, unseen ways. She passed through a group of business travelers gathered around the newsstand, all wearing the same charcoal suits and Bluetooth earpieces, none of them giving her more than a passing glance. But the man behind the counter, a middle-aged clerk with tired eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, watched her closely as she walked by. She knew the look, not of admiration, not even hostility, just suspicion dressed up as curiosity. She offered no reaction. The air inside the terminal was dry, recycled, humming low with fluorescent fatigue. Evelyn approached the first-class check-in desk and handed over her ticket with a steady hand, meeting the attendant's eyes directly. The young woman took the ticket, scanned it without comment, and handed it back with a faint, rehearsed smile. "Thank you, Miss Rhodes. You're all set. Boarding begins in 20 minutes. Evelyn nodded, stepped aside, and sat on the edge of the nearest bench, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap. Around her the world moved on. Suitcases wheeled across tile, voices murmured into phones. A child cried somewhere in the distance, but Evelyn sat still, unbothered on the surface but quietly aware. Aware of who watched. Aware of who didn't happen. Aware of the tension that began like a thread at the base of her neck, slowly winding tighter with every breath she took. This wasn't fear. It was something older than that. It was memory. Memory of rooms where her voice was doubted until proven. Of hallways where she was mistaken for the assistant, never the architect. Of glances that dissected rather than saw. The 1990s hadn't erased those habits. It had only taught people to do them more quietly. And Evelyn, she'd learned to notice what others hoped she wouldn't. Her fingers traced the edge of her ticket once more, not for reassurance, but as ritual. She was not afraid, but she was ready. She watched as a white man, in a polo shirt and khakis, breezed through the boarding gate with barely a glance from security. She watched as another in a wrinkled business coat shoved past a woman in line, and received only a chuckle from the guard on duty. Evelyn didn't say a word. She just sat and watched, her silence more eloquent than any outburst. She had learned that stillness, when paired with the right gaze, could be louder than outrage. Her watch ticked softly. 7:23. 17 minutes to boarding. Somewhere beyond the platform, a train horn cried out in the distance, long, low, mournful. Evelyn didn't look toward the sound. She looked inward, steadying herself for whatever came next. Because women like her didn't just ride trains. They had to claim every seat twice, once with a ticket and again with their presence. At gate 11 the air felt different, not colder, not louder, just more alert, as if the very space had learned to tighten its breath when someone like Evelyn walked through it. She didn't notice it at first, not consciously, but her body did. Her shoulders stiffened half an inch, her palms pressed flat against her thighs, her eyes scanned with more intention than curiosity. A cluster of station security staff stood to the right of the boarding lane, casually leaning against the wall under a blinking exit sign, not speaking, just watching in that quiet way certain men do when they're looking for something to challenge. Evelyn felt their gaze land before it moved. Leonard Burr, the older of the two, wore his badge like a threat and his belt like a trophy. His build still broad from his days on the city force, though time had begun to round out his edges. His hands were thick fingers like bolts, always resting too close to his utility gear, not because he needed to, but because it made people nervous. "Who's that one?" he muttered, without looking, tipping his chin toward Evelyn as she stood near the departure kiosk checking her watch. The younger guard beside him, Ronald Mace, barely lifted his head before answering, "No idea. Looks clean though. Real clean." Burr narrowed his eyes, watching Evelyn straighten her jacket, then stepped toward the roped-off first-class entrance with a smoothness that didn't ask permission. "That's what bothers me," Burr said quietly, the words curling like smoke from a match. "Too clean. Too confident." Mace shrugged, not sure if it was worth caring. Burr, however, had made up his mind. He shifted his weight, cracked his knuckles, and said under his breath, "She don't fit the profile of someone who bought that ticket herself." Across the terminal, Evelyn handed her boarding pass to the attendant, her tone warm but brief. She wasn't unfriendly, but she wasn't interested in conversation either, not before boarding, not in spaces where even kindness could be used against her. The attendant scanned the pass, gave a short nod, and returned it without comment. Everything in order. Or so it seemed. But as Evelyn turned toward the velvet rope, Burr stepped forward, too casual to be coincidence, too calculated to be friendly. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, placing a hand lightly against the barricade. "Mind if I ask you a quick question?" His voice was calm, almost polite, but it carried the tone of someone who already believed the answer wouldn't satisfy him. Evelyn paused, turned slowly, and looked him in the eye, her expression neutral, practiced. "Is there a problem?" Burr smiled the way some men do when they're pretending they're not about to do something they've done 100 times. "Not unless you make one," he said. "Just a routine check." Evelyn blinked once evenly. "My documents are in order," she replied, keeping her voice low and clear. "I've just been verified at the desk." Burr ignored that. "First class, huh?" he asked, stepping a little closer. "Kind of fancy for a Tuesday morning." Then almost too quietly, he added, "You fly much?" The question wasn't about travel, it was about worth, about whether he believed she belonged. Evelyn let the pause hang just long enough before replying, "Often enough." Burr gave a low chuckle, not amused, not surprised. "That ticket," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You sure it's not borrowed?" Mace was watching now, half interested, half bored, chewing invisible gum and keeping his hands in his pockets. "I don't borrow anything," Evelyn said. The sentence came out steady, but she could feel her heart rate beginning to rise, not from fear but from frustration, the familiar ache of knowing exactly how this kind of script plays out. She had felt it in other rooms with other men behind desks and across conference tables, always beginning with a smile and ending with a warning. Burr reached for the scanner near the gate and tapped his finger against the screen. "Just need to double-check something," he muttered, not looking at her. "Sometimes the system flags duplicates." Evelyn didn't answer. She stood straight, her hands visible, her chin slightly lifted, the very shape of her body refusing to shrink. Burr slid her pass under the scanner once, then twice. "Huh," he said, frowning. "It's not reading right." Mace walked over, peered at the screen, then glanced at Evelyn's suit. "Maybe she's in the wrong line," he offered, voice low but pointed. "She's in the wrong something," Burr muttered. Evelyn could feel it happening now, the shift, the moment when inconvenience becomes interrogation. Her eyes moved toward the other passengers being waved through with ease, men in wrinkled shirts, women carrying oversized purses, no one being questioned, no one being stopped. Only her, only always her. "You scanned it twice," she said firmly. "It's valid." Burr smiled again, tighter this time. "Funny thing about systems," he said. "Sometimes they don't recognize what they're looking at." The line between mistake and message had already been crossed, and Evelyn knew better than to miss it. She didn't flinch, didn't argue. She just breathed in slowly and waited. A toddler cried somewhere in the distance, a porter dragged a suitcase across the tile, and a small voice on the overhead speakers announced boarding for train 218. But at gate 11 time had stilled. Two men with authority stood between Evelyn and a place she had already paid for, already earned, already stepped into, yet still wasn't allowed to fully claim. And as Burr adjusted his radio and gave a short nod to Mace, Evelyn understood one thing with cold certainty: this wasn't about the ticket. It never was. The moment Leonard Burr stepped in front of her with both feet planted like he owned the tiles beneath them, Evelyn felt the air change. Not in temperature or scent, but in weight, in density, in the way something thick and unseen began pressing down on her chest, as if the station itself had grown quieter to give this moment more echo. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he said, voice still calm, but no longer performing friendliness. And Evelyn knew then this wasn't a conversation, it was an extraction. She reached into her tote slowly, carefully, every movement measured to avoid triggering whatever version of non-compliance he was silently waiting for. She handed him her driver's license and boarding pass again, her fingers grazing his just briefly, though he pulled them back quickly as if touching her might stain. He didn't look at the ID first. He looked at her face, then back to the ID, then back to her face again, his eyes narrowing in that way. Some men do when they're trying to find the lie they already believe is there. "You say this is yours," he muttered, not asking, just accusing gently. Evelyn didn't blink. "It is." Her voice was even calm, clipped like a page torn perfectly from the center of a book. He looked at her for another beat, then passed the ID to Mace, who took it with a little too much interest for someone not technically in charge. They stood there for a moment, the three of them caught in a tableau so familiar it almost made Evelyn laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully, exhaustingly predictable. The black woman in a fitted blazer and pressed slacks. The white officers unsure how she got through the cracks. The quiet crowd pretending to mind their own business. A cough echoed from somewhere near the snack kiosk. A luggage wheel scraped the floor. Somewhere in the far end of the terminal a child laughed. But here by gate 11 everything was still. Everything was about to tip. Burr leaned in slightly as if sharing a secret no one had asked to hear. "You always dress like this for travel?" he asked, eyes drifting over her outfit, not admiring, appraising. Or is this just a special occasion? Evelyn folded her arms slowly, resting them just above her belt line. I dress how I choose, she said, her tone still level but with the faint edge of steel beneath it. Burr's grin widened, but it wasn't friendly. You must work in fashion or something, he said, clearly fishing. Mace chuckled, adding, nah. Looks more like someone playing rich than actually being it. It wasn't the first time Evelyn had been spoken to like that, like her presence in certain places was a performance instead of a right. It didn't matter that her ID was valid, that her ticket had cleared, that she had done everything the system ever asked of her to be seen as safe. What they saw wasn't her credentials or her conduct, they saw her color, her poise, her refusal to shrink, and that more than anything offended them. We're going to have to ask you to step aside for a moment, Burr finally said, gesturing toward a roped-off area behind the boarding gate where a single metal chair sat beneath a blinking ceiling light. Evelyn looked past him toward the train platform where a white man in khakis and a Patagonia fleece was being waved through with barely a glance. Why? She asked. Not combative, just tired. Burr shrugged too quickly. Your scan didn't go through properly. Could be a glitch. We just want to be sure. You scanned it twice, she replied, her voice low. It worked both times until you took it. Mace stepped forward, then hands now visible, palms slightly raised. Look, no need to make a big deal. We just want to ask you a few things in private, make sure everything checks out. Evelyn stood still, not because she was frozen, but because every instinct told her that moving any sudden motion, any visible annoyance, any expression sharper than calm, would be used against her. Behind her, someone adjusted their bag. The sound of a zipper echoed like a gun cocking. Her skin itched with the weight of stares that weren't quite direct but heavy enough to feel. She took one slow breath in grounding herself the way she had taught others to do in conference rooms, in courtrooms, in classrooms full of faces looking for composure. No, she said. Just one word, but it carried the force of years, of experience, of decisions made again and again to remain steady when everything around her tried to shake her loose. Burr's eyes narrowed, and for a second the mask slipped. His voice dropped half an octave. Excuse me, Evelyn didn't raise hers. I'm not stepping aside because you're uncomfortable with how I look, she said. I've done everything right. Mace scratched the back of his neck, clearly unsure now. Ma'am, we don't want to escalate this, he said. Evelyn turned fully toward him, her hands still visible, her posture tall. Then don't, she said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. It buzzed between them like a wire about to snap. Evelyn could feel the heat rising beneath her collar, not from shame but from restraint. She could hear the unspoken things, the assumptions, the justifications, the ready-made excuses already forming in their heads like rote scripture. We're just following protocol, Burr muttered again, but his tone had hardened like a man who realized he was losing the room. This could have been quick. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't blink. It still can, she said, not as threat, not as plea, just truth. But Burr wasn't interested in quick anymore. He was interested in control. And when a system like his doesn't get obedience, it reaches for humiliation. Then we're going to do this the hard way, he said, already stepping forward, already reaching. And Evelyn, though her heart pounded like a slow drum in her chest, stood exactly where she was unmoved, unbending, already knowing what was coming next. The click of the handcuffs wasn't loud, but it echoed in Evelyn's bones like the sharp memory of every time someone mistook dignity for defiance. She didn't flinch when Burr took her wrists, didn't resist when he twisted her arms behind her back with a grip that wasn't brutal, but wasn't gentle either. It was the kind of grip meant to demonstrate dominance without bruising, the kind of force that lived in the space between plausible denial and deliberate shame. The cold metal bit into the soft flesh above her wrists, and still she stood tall, chin-high spine, unbroken, the picture of a woman refusing to let the cuffs write her story. Around them, the station kept moving, but slower now, as if the air had thickened, as if every passerby had suddenly remembered they were late, and also deeply uncomfortable. Some watched from behind coffee cups and sunglasses, others pretended not to see their feet shifting awkwardly, their eyes darting away too fast. One woman actually stopped, lips parted like she might say something, then just clutched her purse tighter and kept walking. No one raised a voice, no one raised a hand. And Evelyn felt it, not just the metal on her skin, but the weight of their silence, heavy and suffocating like humidity before a storm. Burr's voice cut through the static, smooth and flat, like he was reading from a script written years ago. Failure to comply, he announced loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, disregarded multiple requests to step aside. Evelyn didn't turn to look at him, didn't dignify the lie with a response. Her hands were locked behind her, her coat slightly bunched, her breathing slow but steady. Every muscle in her body held tension like piano wire. She wasn't afraid of what came next, but she was deeply aware of it. Mace hovered nearby, his stance unsure, now his face flickering between discomfort and detachment. He glanced toward the growing cluster of onlookers but said nothing, offering no support, no caution, just a vague look that said this wasn't his moment to intervene. Evelyn caught his eye for half a second, not pleading, just present. And in that gaze was a single question she didn't speak out loud. "You know this is wrong. What are you going to do about it?" But the answer was already written in the way he looked away. They marched her toward the cordoned-off bench near the terminal's security desk, not hidden from view but elevated just enough to make it clear this wasn't a detainment, it was a display. Evelyn's heels clicked against the tile floor, each step too loud in the new silence around her. She didn't stumble, didn't slow, didn't let them push her. She walked under her own power, even as they tried to drag her dignity behind them, like something discarded. At the bench, Burr motioned for her to sit. Evelyn lowered herself gently, her movement precise, calculated, not weak, not defeated, just determined not to let the moment break her. The cuffs pulled tight against the bones of her wrist as she adjusted to the hard metal seat. Her shoulders stayed square. Her eyes scanned the room not wildly but calmly, like someone cataloging truths in real time. "You made this harder than it had to be," Burr said, standing just to her side, arms crossed, voice still annoyingly casual. Evelyn exhaled through her nose, slow and shallow. "I followed every instruction," she replied, her tone even not raised. "You just didn't like the way I stood." He scoffed, not replying because deep down he knew she was right, but that wasn't the game they were playing. This wasn't about law or policy. This was about control, about reminding her which rooms she was allowed to belong in and which ones required an apology just for entering. The light above her flickered once, buzzing faintly like a dying fly trapped in glass. Someone nearby took out a disposable camera, cheap, grainy, and snapped a photo. Evelyn didn't flinch. Another man whispered something into his payphone receiver while keeping one eye on her. A child, no more than 7 or 8, asked his father in a voice that carried too far, "Why is that lady in trouble?" The father hushed him quickly. "She's not," he said, almost too fast. "Keep walking." And they did. Evelyn sat, her fingers starting to numb slightly from the pressure of the cuffs, but she didn't complain. She didn't ask for relief. She didn't beg. This, she knew, was not just an inconvenience, it was a message. A message to her, and to everyone watching, about where lines were drawn and who was allowed to cross them. The irony, of course, was that she had done nothing wrong. Her ticket was valid. Her ID was verified. Her background, if they'd bothered to check, it was pristine. But none of that mattered not when the people tasked with enforcing the rules believed they were the exception to them. Not when 2 men with uniforms and bitterness saw a poised black woman in a tailored suit and decided that confidence looked too much like arrogance to go unpunished. Time moved slowly at the edge of humiliation. Burr shifted from one foot to the other, clearly expecting her to squirm, to cry, to crack. But Evelyn gave him nothing. Not because she wasn't angry. She was. But her anger lived in stillness. It lived in the way she held her back straight even when the cuffs dug in. It lived in the quiet refusal to validate his narrative with fear. Across the station, the speaker crackled to life with a new announcement. Train 222 to Washington, D.C., now boarding at Platform 11. Evelyn didn't look. She just closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to hold her center. She didn't know yet what was about to shift behind the scenes. Didn't know who was watching from afar. Didn't know what part of her identity, buried in files, hidden for protection, was now crawling through federal servers, setting off alarms that hadn't rung in years. What she did know was this: no matter how hard they tried to shrink her into silence, she would never make herself small enough to fit the shape they had carved for her. Not here, not now, not ever. The holding area wasn't a room exactly. It was more like a half-forgotten corner between two utility corridors bordered by a waist-high metal railing and framed on one side by a humming vending machine that hadn't been restocked in weeks. The bench Evelyn sat on was made of stainless steel, bolted to the tile, too cold, too narrow, deliberately uncomfortable. Above her, a flickering fluorescent bulb buzzed in and out like a tired wasp circling its own exhaustion. She shifted slightly, feeling the cuffs dig into the thin skin above her wrist bones, her back still straight, her breath measured, refusing to slump into the shape they wanted her to take. Nearby, Burr pretended to be busy, filling out a form on a clipboard, his pen moving faster than his mind, each stroke less about protocol and more about performance. Mace leaned against the wall a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes flickering back and forth between Evelyn and the trickle of curious onlookers who passed by just slowly enough to see, but never slow enough to stop. Their murmurs floated through the air like static. What happened? She doesn't look dangerous. Must have been something serious. Evelyn heard them all but let none of it land. She knew the script. She'd lived through it more times than she cared to count, and by now it was the silence that always screamed the loudest. A security camera blinked red above the bench, its lens pointed slightly down, and to the right missing her face by a few degrees, as if even the technology had learned where not to look. Burr cleared his throat. "We'll process you in a moment," he said, not looking at her as if the words were part of a customer service routine he'd run through too many times. Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't ask for clarification. She simply waited her silence, not an absence but a statement, one that unsettled Burr, far more than shouting ever could. Across the hall, a young officer with a clipboard approached slowly, her posture uncertain but her steps precise. Her name tag read L. Chen, and her eyes, dark, sharp, deeply observant, moved between Evelyn and the two men standing beside her. Lisa Chen had only been on the job for 7 months, transferred from a smaller transit hub, where the biggest conflict was usually a missed ticket or a broken fare machine. She had seen enough in that short time to understand the unspoken layers in this moment, and as she stepped closer, she felt the prickle of tension wrap around her like static from a wool sweater. She didn't speak to Burr. She didn't interrupt. She simply stopped near the edge of the holding space and watched. Evelyn looked up and met her gaze calm, unwavering, not pleading, just present, just real. Something about that eye contact made Lisa's grip on her clipboard tighten, the cardboard creaking faintly beneath her fingers. She'd read every line in the procedural manual, memorized every escalation protocol, but none of that prepared her for the human weight of this woman sitting in silence, cuffed, composed, and quietly unraveling the illusion that this was normal. Mace turned slightly and gestured toward her. "Need you to log this into the system," he said. "Suspected ticket fraud, non-compliance, verbal resistance." Lisa blinked once. "Was she searched?" she asked, her voice, careful but clear. Burr scoffed. "No need. This isn't that deep." Lisa didn't reply, just nodded, turning back toward the nearby workstation tucked behind a low counter, half hidden behind a battered plastic sign that read, "Staff Only." She swiped her badge, opened the terminal, and typed Evelyn's name first and last as it appeared on the boarding pass, now clipped to Burr's form. What happened next didn't make noise. It didn't flash or beep. But the screen paused for just long enough to register as strange. Then a quiet prompt appeared. "Access restricted. Tier 4 clearance required." Lisa stared at it for half a second longer than she should have, then hit the back arrow and re-entered the data slower this time. Same result. She glanced toward Evelyn, who had returned to stillness, and then back at the screen, her jaw tightening slightly. She didn't say anything, didn't make a face. She just made a note on her clipboard and walked away like nothing had happened. Evelyn, watching her from the corner of her eye, didn't react, but something in her posture eased just slightly. Not because she expected help, but because she recognized the flicker of doubt in someone who still remembered what fairness was supposed to feel like. That doubt was rare in rooms like this. It was oxygen. Meanwhile, Burr checked his watch and muttered, "Let's wrap this up, though." He made no move to release her. Mace shifted his weight again, less cocky now, more like someone who just realized the moment was bigger than they expected. "You want to call it in?" he asked. Burr hesitated. Not yet. He wasn't ready to give up control, not yet. Not until he was sure she'd cracked just a little. But Evelyn had given him nothing. No panic, no tears, no raised voice. Only silence that grew heavier with every passing second. She didn't know what Lisa had seen on the screen, didn't know what level of clearance her name triggered, but she felt the ripple it created. The kind of ripple systems try to suppress before they become waves. And as she sat there, cuffed, exposed, humiliated in plain sight, but somehow still sovereign, Evelyn knew something was beginning to shift. Not fast, not loudly, but inevitably. Because the people who believe they can break you often forget the most dangerous kind of resistance is the kind that never needs to shout. It just waits, unshaken, unapologetic, unmoved. Lisa Chen didn't return to her station right away. She lingered near the vending machine a few feet behind Burr and Mace, her body angled as if casually reading the snack options, but her mind replayed the restricted access prompt that had just flashed across her screen. It wasn't a common message. In fact, she'd only seen it once before during a training simulation involving mock threats and classified identities, scenarios so far removed from real-world transit duty they'd felt like fiction. But this wasn't fiction now. This was a woman in cuffs, seated calmly under flickering light, and a terminal that had paused before refusing to show her anything at all. Something didn't line up and the feeling crawled up, Lisa's spine like cold water slipping under a shirt collar. She glanced over her shoulder toward Evelyn again, studying the lines of her face, the set of her mouth, the posture that didn't sag. There was something about the woman's stillness that didn't feel like defeat. It felt like calculation, like strategy, like a clock winding inside her chest, counting down not to panic but to revelation. And Lisa, despite every layer of protocol she had been taught to follow, without question, felt the tremor of something important about to come loose. "You all right?" a voice broke into her thoughts. It was Mace, now closer, his thumbs tucked into his belt loops, trying to sound casual but missing the mark. Lisa nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just..." And surprised, the system flagged her, she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Never seen a Tier 4 block before." Mace raised an eyebrow. "Tier what?" he asked, his tone tilting toward a smirk. Lisa realized she'd said too much, so she deflected. "Probably nothing. Could be a data error." But she knew better. She knew data errors didn't lock out full identity screens. They didn't trigger restricted access prompts. And they didn't hang in the system like a warning meant only for people 2 pay grades above her. Back at the desk, Lisa slid behind the low counter, shielding her screen from peripheral view. She opened a secure maintenance portal, not something she technically had clearance for, but something she'd memorized the steps to during a slow night shift 2 months ago. She tapped out a single search phrase, not a full query, not an override, just 5 quiet words sent through a diagnostic field. "Think this is her." Then she hit send, targeting it to a dormant relay address embedded in the staff network architecture, a code she wasn't supposed to know and certainly wasn't supposed to use. The cursor blinked once, then again, then vanished. Lisa sat back slowly, the quiet around her suddenly louder than before. Behind her, Burr paced like a man still pretending he had control, while Evelyn remained seated, cuffed and patient, as if she knew that timing was its own kind of weapon. Meanwhile, deep inside the airport's network infrastructure, past the operational firewalls beneath the public-facing software, something responded. A server light blinked amber in a secure subunit housed beneath the administrative wing. A line of code long dormant came alive like a muscle, twitching after years of sleep. Within 60 seconds, a systems analyst on the 3rd floor received an alert marked PR Risk, Level 3 Identity Shield Query. He stared at the screen, confused, then typed in a manual override to view the source. The screen loaded slowly, and when it did, the footage was already active. The analyst watched Evelyn in real time, her back straight, wrists bound, expression unreadable. Then he pulled up her name, Evelyn Rhodes, and the room seemed to grow still. "No, not again," he muttered under his breath, suddenly remembering an off-the-record briefing from a year ago. Across the office, a senior official turned when he heard the tone in his voice. "Is it her?" the man asked. The analyst didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back downstairs, Lisa's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped into the corridor and pulled it out, shielding the screen from Burr's line of sight. One message. No sender. Just a single line: standby for code review. Subject under live hold. Delay all further engagement. Her chest tightened as she read it again, the weight of the moment finally settling in full. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned to the desk, heart pounding but face calm. Burr looked up from his clipboard. "You run her?" he asked. Lisa nodded. "Systems reviewing. Might take a while." Burr frowned. "Since when do they take a while?" Lisa shrugged. "Maybe there's a backlog. Maybe she's someone important." She watched his face carefully, but Burr just snorted. "Everyone thinks they're important when the cuffs go on." And he turned away. Evelyn from her seat had caught the brief flicker of something shifting in Lisa's demeanor. It wasn't fear, it wasn't sympathy, it was alertness. And Evelyn, trained in the silent language of power and consequence, recognized the look of someone suddenly realizing they were playing with a fuse they hadn't known was lit. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Lisa didn't look at her again, but she felt the weight of that silence, the strange grounding sense that something old and hidden was surfacing, something bigger than uniform codes and transport policy. Lisa had stepped into a current without knowing where it led, but now, as the hum of the terminal buzzed in her ears and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, she understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a system about to reckon with its own blind spot, and Evelyn Rhodes was the shape of that reckoning. The message didn't make a sound, didn't flash or pulse or scream for attention. It simply slid into the oversight server like a whisper slipped through a crack in a locked door. But in certain rooms among certain people, that kind of silence was louder than alarms. A technician at the top-floor monitoring station blinked at the words on his screen, his coffee halfway to his lips, forgotten now as a series of coded terms unfolded in precise, emotionless font. Tier 4 Identity Trigger. Name confirmed: Evelyn Rhodes. Protective seal active. Reauthorization in progress. He stared at the terminal for a beat too long, long enough for his supervisor to notice the hesitation. "What is it?" she asked, stepping beside him, not bothering to mask the edge in her voice. He didn't answer right away. He just turned the screen toward her and let the data speak for itself. The supervisor's face didn't shift. She didn't need to read more than the first few lines. "Shut it down," she said, already walking away. "No more scans. No more queries. Hold everything until command reaches out." Downstairs at the checkpoint, Evelyn could feel it, not see it, not hear it, but sense it in the way people began to move differently. The energy in the air shifted ever so slightly, like the atmosphere before a summer storm, that dense and waiting kind of stillness that settles in your lungs. Lisa Chen hadn't said anything since returning to her post, but something in her hands had changed. They moved slower, more deliberately, like she was trying to look busy without drawing attention. Burr was still pacing, still talking, still convinced this was routine, but Mace had gone quiet. And Evelyn noticed that kind of quiet more than anything. She sat spine-tall, wrists aching from the cuffs, and allowed her mind to drift not out of the moment but into it. Into memory. Into places only someone like her would revisit in times like this. She thought of the years spent behind mirrored glass answering questions with caution. She thought of whispered protocols and temporary names, and the feeling of having her identity treated as currency, traded for protection, for privacy, for survival. She had paid the price to be unseen for years. Now it seemed the debt had come due. Up in the restricted wing of Homeland's crisis office, an encrypted terminal lit up with a code unseen in nearly a decade. A gray-haired man in a black vest, no nameplate, no insignia, read the incoming packet without speaking, his eyes narrowing only slightly. He reached for a landline phone mounted to the wall, one without numbers, just a single red button beneath a clear plastic case. He pressed it once. The signal traveled through a system most agents didn't know existed, bypassing every standard layer of TSA, DHS, and Department of Transportation. Back at the station, Lisa's screen blinked. A simple directive: hold subject. All comms locked. Cease device access immediately. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not sure what she was supposed to feel. Fear, relief, awe. She turned her head slightly and looked at Evelyn again, really looked this time. And for a split second it felt like watching someone holding back the tide with just the weight of their posture. "Everything okay?" Mace asked, his voice uncertain, now no longer leaning on confidence. Lisa nodded. "We've been told to wait," she said simply. Burr furrowed his brow. Wait for what? Lisa didn't look at him. Just wait. At that moment, Evelyn felt the shift move from quiet to seismic. She didn't know the message. She didn't know the screen. But she could see it in their posture, in the way authority bent ever so slightly beneath her presence, not because of who they thought she was, but because of who they had just found out she might be. Across a series of federal terminals, some buried in sub-basements beneath D.C., others in glass towers in Virginia, Evelyn's name was being reintroduced into a system that had once sworn to erase her from visibility for her own safety. Her file opened like a sealed vault, not a passenger, not a civilian, but a flag one that came with political weight, legal firewalls, and a history written in red ink. The daughter of a judge, the sister of a diplomat, the survivor of a security breach so dangerous it had been redacted from internal logs to avoid public panic. And now she was here on a bench in a station in handcuffs, with strangers debating whether her name matched the picture they had drawn in their heads. The system had protected her name, but it had not prepared for her silence. Lisa Chen sat still, reading every word on her screen and understanding that no one had trained her for this. The person in front of her wasn't just a mistake in the system. She was the system's blind spot. Back on the bench, Evelyn breathed slowly, allowing the world around her to spiral. Let them scramble, she thought. Let them feel what it's like to not know the rules of a game they invented. The man in the upstairs operations office pressed another button. This one sent a silent notification to the regional director, who was mid-flight on a secure plane and hadn't planned on dealing with any emergency that morning. His assistant tapped him on the shoulder, handed him a secure tablet. He read 3 words that told him everything: Evelyn Rhodes detained. He didn't ask questions. He made a call, and somewhere in the sky something began to turn. In the waiting area, a child dropped a toy, and its plastic rattle cut through the moment like a gunshot. Burr flinched, not because of the sound, but because he suddenly realized how quiet it had become. And Evelyn. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just looked forward, still bound, still upright, still unshaken, because some people scream to reclaim their power, and some people just sit still until the whole room remembers who they are. And today that room was remembering. It began with a sound no one in the terminal could identify at first, a low, distant thrum, almost like a humming engine wrapped in fog. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy, the kind of vibration that moved through concrete before it ever reached the ear. People glanced toward the wide glass windows at the far end of the station, brows furrowed, unsure whether what they felt was real or just the tension already thick in the air. Evelyn heard it too, not as a warning but as confirmation. Something had shifted, not within her but around her, and the weight of that shift pressed gently against her chest, like a door slowly opening. Outside, a matte gray helicopter descended onto the auxiliary lot behind the terminal, kicking up dust and wrappers and the startled squawks of pigeons not used to such disruption. No markings, no logos, just a machine that moved like it belonged to no one and answered to few. When the door opened, a man stepped out, not tall, not dramatic, but composed in a way that suggested he had long since stopped needing to introduce himself. He wore a dark overcoat and leather gloves, his silver hair clipped short, his face unreadable and unmoved. He didn't look around. He didn't assess. He just walked straight through the back entrance of the station badge, unseen clearance, unquestioned path already cleared by silence. Downstairs, Lisa Chen was rereading the directive for the 5th time, her pulse steady but her breath shorter than usual. She didn't know who had sent the message, but she knew what it meant. She glanced at Evelyn, who remained still, her hands still cuffed behind her, her posture unchanged. There was a calm there that Lisa couldn't explain, like the woman had already seen the ending and simply didn't feel the need to rush the middle. Burr, on the other hand, was growing increasingly restless. He tapped the edge of the desk with his fingers, stared at his watch, then muttered under his breath, "What the hell's taking so long?" May stood nearby, pretending to look at a clipboard, but his eyes kept darting to Evelyn, as if her silence might suddenly erupt. It didn't, and then he entered. The man in the overcoat didn't announce himself. He didn't flash a badge or bark commands. He just stepped into the holding area with the kind of presence that made sound itself pull back. Burr straightened unconsciously, sensing authority but not recognizing it. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, though his voice faltered slightly. The man said 3 words, low, clear, and final: "Code 1870. Now." The room froze. Lisa's breath caught. Mace looked confused. Burr blinked, his face shifting from annoyance to unease. "I'm sorry, Code," what he asked, grasping at the only defense he had left: ignorance. But the man didn't repeat himself. He stepped forward, stopped directly in front of Evelyn, and gave her a slight nod. Not deferential, not commanding, just human. Evelyn looked up, met his eyes, and held them. Something passed between them in that glance, something old understood, unspoken. Then he turned to Burr. "Remove the cuffs," he said, not raising his voice, not asking. Burr hesitated for half a second too long. "Sir, we're still waiting on confirmation," he began, but the man cut him off with a look so sharp it sliced the sentence in half before it landed. That was the confirmation. Lisa moved first. She stepped forward, pulled the key from her belt loop, and unlocked the cuffs. The metal snapped open, the sound, small but enormous in the silence that followed. Evelyn didn't rub her wrists. She didn't stand quickly. She simply brought her arms forward, flexed her fingers once, and exhaled like someone releasing not tension but permission. She stood slow and measured, and faced the room. Burr stepped back instinctively, not out of fear but out of recognition. Recognition that he had just crossed a line far bigger than he could see. Mace looked at the ground. Lisa looked at Evelyn. The man in the overcoat looked at no one. He just stood beside her like a sentry reclaiming a space never meant to be stolen. Outside, the buzz of the helicopter faded, but the energy in the terminal remained suspended, as if the station itself had realized it had played along with something deeply wrong. Evelyn turned her head slowly, scanning the people, still pretending not to watch. Then she looked forward and began to walk. Not fast, not triumphant, but with the quiet grace of someone who refused to leave anything behind. Not dignity, not truth, not even the silence that had protected her when nothing else did. As she passed Burr, she didn't look at him. She didn't need to. His body had already answered everything she could have said. And behind her, the man in the overcoat followed, not as a shadow, not as a guardian, but as a reminder: when true power arrives, it does not knock, it reclaims. The video wasn't supposed to matter, not at first, not to Burr, not to Mace, not to the system that had treated Evelyn's silence as an absence rather than a presence. It had been recorded by a teenager leaning against a support column 20 yards away, his phone tilted just enough to appear casual, his thumb resting on the record button out of instinct rather than intent. There was no framing, no commentary, no clever edits, just the raw hum of a station's undercurrent, and the steady, shameful unraveling of an illusion called procedure. The footage opened on Evelyn sitting quietly on the steel bench, hands cuffed, eyes, forward posture intact. Then Burr appeared in frame, arms folded, face twisted in something between smugness and suspicion. His voice, barely raised, carried just enough for the mic to catch it. "This would have been easier if you hadn't dressed like you had something to prove." And from the side, Mace added with a smirk that didn't quite land, "She's probably used to being treated like this. I mean, come on." No one in the moment had noticed the kid filming, and maybe that's why it felt so real, because it wasn't staged, it wasn't performative, it was exposure in its purest form. By the time Evelyn was walking out of the station, uncuffed, unbothered, and completely unchanged in her expression, the clip had already been posted. The caption wasn't dramatic, it didn't need to be. It said only, "They thought she was no one. Watch until the end." Within an hour, it had been viewed over 200,000 times. It spread not because of violence or shouting or chaos, but because of what it didn't contain, because it captured the quiet efficiency of humiliation, the casual way power exercised itself in full daylight without fear of consequence. There was something about the steadiness of Evelyn's body, the way she never flinched, never raised her voice, never surrendered even an inch of her presence, that turned the silence into a statement louder than any protest could have been. By lunchtime, major news outlets were calling it the train station incident, even though no one had confirmed the exact location. The hashtags shifted from regional to national in under 2 hours, and by the end of the day, Evelyn Rhodes was no longer just a woman on a bench. She was a mirror held up to a system built on certainty that it would never be challenged from the inside. Some responses were immediate and explosive. "Who is she?" trended across every platform. A blurry still from the video, Evelyn with her hands cuffed, her chin raised just slightly, became the anchor image for articles, threads, and conversations from every corner of the country. Commentators dissected her clothing, her posture, her restraint, as if she were a character in a film rather than a person who had simply refused to yield. Civil rights lawyers began sharing the video in training seminars before the day was out. Professors played it in ethics classes. Church leaders quoted her silence in Sunday sermons. Not because she had given them a speech, but because she hadn't. Because she had left space, and that space had filled with reflection people didn't know they were capable of. Back in the terminal, Evelyn had already left. She hadn't said a word to the press. She hadn't posted online. She hadn't made herself available for interview. She had simply walked out as she had arrived, without apology, without announcement, without bending to the moment that tried so hard to reduce her. But behind her, the ripple was becoming a wave. Burr and Mace, still unaware of the video's existence, were talking in low tones behind the desk, trying to craft a version of the story that might justify the cuffs, the delay, the tone. "She was acting suspicious," Burr insisted. "Didn't want to cooperate," Mace nodded, adding, "Yeah, she tried to make a scene. You saw how she looked at us like she was daring us." They didn't know their voices had been captured. They didn't know their smirks had been frozen in frame. They didn't know that their casual language, unremarkable to them, was now echoing across boardrooms and courtrooms and kitchen tables in homes that hadn't thought much about authority until now. Because what the video captured wasn't just an incident, it was a pattern, a truth that had lived in the shadows of policy and protocol for too long now, dragged blinking into the light by one small act of defiance wrapped in stillness. In Washington, the name Evelyn Rhodes began to appear on internal memos. Quiet meetings were called in hallways and glass offices, where men in tailored suits whispered to each other about risk optics exposure. Someone pulled her sealed file, skimmed the redacted lines, and muttered, "We're going to need a statement." But Evelyn made none. She didn't respond. She didn't explain. She let the world catch up to what she already knew, that silence, when wielded properly, doesn't retreat. It redefines. And as the video crossed 1 million views, then 2, then 5 people began to say the same thing in different words, in different cities. She never shouted, but somehow we heard her louder than anyone else. Evelyn didn't speak to the press the next morning, nor the one after that. No podium, no press conference, no carefully framed apology or explanation delivered from behind marble steps. She simply went home alone quietly, as she had arrived at that train station, and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of black coffee cooling in her hand, watching the world argue about her through the flickering television screen. Anchors speculated. Pundits spun. Commentators debated her motives, her silence, her strength, her poise, as though she were a headline rather than a human being who had simply refused to bend when someone expected her to break. The voice of the morning news host spilled from the television, polished and practiced. "Still no official comment from Evelyn Rhodes," she said, "but sources confirm she has retained no legal counsel and declined all media requests." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver from the screen, but her mind was elsewhere, floating somewhere between memory and fatigue, between the warm smell of morning toast and the weight of knowing she had become a symbol without consent. Outside, neighborhood children played tag on the sidewalk, their laughter high and clear, not yet dulled by the complications of grown-up rules. A postal worker waved through the window. A neighbor left a small bouquet of wildflowers on the front step without ringing the bell. Evelyn saw none of it directly, but she felt it like a shift in barometric pressure, the sense that even silence, when shaped by truth, can move through walls. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Not a reporter, not a camera crew, just a delivery driver with a manila envelope signature required. Inside, she found a short letter from a former federal colleague, someone she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The note was handwritten plain and to the point. "You've reminded us of what we forgot. Thank you for standing still long enough for the rest of us to see." No signature, just initials. But Evelyn knew who it was from. She placed the letter gently inside a drawer, folded once with care. Then for the first time since the video, she picked up a pen and opened a blank page in the back of her journal. Her handwriting was deliberate, firm, the kind of penmanship formed by a woman who had written more reports, directives, and summaries than she could ever count. But this wasn't for a file. This wasn't for anyone's eyes but hers. She wrote, "They always expect you to shout. That way they can say you were angry. That way they don't have to ask why you were silent." That evening, a scanned letter appeared online, uploaded by a community organizer who had once interviewed Evelyn for a closed-circuit policy forum years earlier. It was a personal note, addressed to no one and everyone at once. Not a manifesto, not a statement, just words, deliberate and clear, written in Evelyn's voice and cadence. You don't owe explanations to people who tried to erase your dignity. You don't owe comfort to those who mistake silence for weakness. What you owe is truth to yourself, to the generations, watching, to the part of you that remembers your grandmother's prayers and your mother's warnings. The seat was mine. I paid for it. I claimed it. I sat still, not because I was unsure, but because I had nothing to prove. It wasn't posted on an official site. It wasn't distributed through news outlets. It simply spread like breath, passed from one screen to another, reaching inboxes, church bulletins, college boards, poetry readings, and even printouts pinned to break room walls. The people who needed to read it found it, and that was enough. At a university on the other side of the country, a literature professor played the video clip to a lecture hall full of wide-eyed students, then read the letter aloud, slowly letting each line settle like dust on hardwood floors. One student raised her hand and asked, "Why didn't she speak during the moment?" The professor paused, then replied, "Because sometimes silence isn't absence, it's a strategy, and sometimes it's the only power they can't predict." In small towns and big cities, the name Evelyn Rhodes became shorthand, not for resistance, but for presence. Her image was sketched into murals on subway walls, quoted beneath headlines that had nothing to do with the train station itself. People began asking different questions, not about the moment, but about the machinery behind it, about the people who felt entitled to determine who belonged and who didn't. And through it all, Evelyn remained where she had always been, not on a podium, not behind a microphone, but on her front porch each morning with the newspaper folded neatly in her lap, sipping her coffee as if the whole country hadn't tried to decide who she was, without ever really asking. One morning, a young woman passed by on her way to class, slowing slightly before speaking. "I watched you in that video," she said, nervously adjusting the strap on her backpack. "You didn't move. You just sat there. It helped me. I don't know how, but it did." Evelyn looked up, gave the smallest of nods, and replied softly, "Sometimes you don't have to move to hold your ground." The girl smiled, nodded back, and kept walking. And Evelyn, in that quiet stillness she had carried through corridors and courtrooms and cold benches beneath humming lights, returned to her coffee without fanfare, because legacy, when rooted in truth, doesn't demand attention. It grows quietly like ivy through stone. The days moved on, but the world around Evelyn didn't return to normal, at least not the version of normal people used to whispering behind closed doors. Her story, once confined to a train terminal and a single bench under buzzing fluorescent light, had spilled out into city halls, high schools, police academies, and Sunday pulpits. But even as others continued to carry her name like a torch in public spaces, Evelyn herself moved through the world with quiet grace, choosing peace over spectacle, dignity over dominance. She kept her routine steady, a walk each morning through the park before the sun fully rose, a trip to the corner store, where the clerk now offered her tea, instead of asking for ID, and afternoons at the community library, reading in the back corner by the dusty biographies, always choosing stories where survival wasn't loud but certain. People still approached her, not constantly, but with regularity, often with the same shy reverence they reserved for sacred spaces. They didn't come asking for photos or autographs, but instead with sentences that began in half-whispers. "I don't mean to bother you, but, Tommy," or "I just wanted to say thank you for what you didn't say." Evelyn listened each time with the same patience she gave to quiet rooms and full hearts. She never rushed anyone, never dismissed their trembling voices, because she knew what it took to gather courage not to speak into a crowd but to speak into stillness. One afternoon, a retired postal worker named Walter stopped her outside the library, hat in hand, eyes misty. "I saw you that day," he said, his voice slow and gravel-thick. "Not in person, but on the screen. It reminded me of my sister. She used to walk like that, like the ground had to ask her permission before it shook beneath her feet." Evelyn smiled, touched his arm, and said simply, "Then she must have known who she was." Walter nodded, and for a moment nothing else needed to be said. Back inside, Evelyn returned to her seat, opened a dog-eared copy of The Souls of Black Folk, and let the words of W.E.B. Du Bois roll over her like rain tapping against a steady roof. She didn't read to escape. She read to remember, to remain tethered to something deeper than headlines or hashtags. Because what happened at the train station wasn't an origin story, it was a chapter. And Evelyn had lived too many chapters to believe any one moment defined the whole. Still, the aftermath lingered in strange and invisible ways. Sometimes she'd catch the lingering gaze of someone too afraid to speak, or the way officers at public buildings adjusted their posture when she walked through metal detectors. In meetings, even ones that had nothing to do with security or justice, her presence shifted the room, not because she demanded it, but because truth once made visible refuses to be unseen. One evening, Evelyn attended a local panel discussion on racial profiling and institutional reform. She hadn't planned to speak, only to listen, but when the moderator glanced her way and asked, "Would you like to share anything?" the room fell quiet, expectant, reverent. She stood slowly, not for performance, but because the weight of attention is heavier than most people realize. Her voice was steady, calm, and deeply grounded. "I didn't sit still on that bench because I was afraid," she said, scanning the audience, her eyes soft but direct. "I sat still because I've spent a lifetime being told to move, to step aside, to not take up too much space in places that were already mine. That day I made a decision. Not to resist with rage, but with rootedness." The room exhaled all at once, a collective breath no one realized they'd been holding. "I don't think the officers who handcuffed me were evil," she continued, "but I think they were certain, and certainty without accountability becomes cruelty wrapped in procedure. What scared them wasn't my voice, it was my stillness. Because stillness doesn't apologize. Stillness holds a mirror." When she finished, she didn't wait for applause. She returned to her seat with the same quiet presence she always carried, and in that moment even the walls seemed to lean in closer to hear her heart beat. After the event, a high school teacher approached her and asked if she'd come speak to her seniors. Evelyn paused, smiled, and said, "I'll come, but not to speak. I'll come to listen. You'd be surprised what the next generation already knows." And she meant it. Later that week, she sat in a circle of teenagers in a sunlit classroom. No microphone, no podium, just a chair and an open window. One girl asked, "How did you stay calm when they treated you like that?" Evelyn looked at her, then out the window for a moment before replying, "I wasn't calm. I was clear. There's a difference. And when you're clear, you don't need to match their noise." She left that room like she left every room, with no desire to dominate, only to dignify. And even though her name now appeared in footnotes and speeches and legal documents, Evelyn herself remained untouched by the spotlight's hunger. She belonged to no party, no movement, no institution. She belonged to stillness, to truth, to the quiet certainty of a woman who had been underestimated one too many times and had finally decided to let that be the system's burden, not hers. Because the lesson wasn't in what she did, it was in what she didn't do. And the world for once had finally learned to listen. It was late autumn when the final letter arrived. Thick envelope, heavy paper embossed with a seal Evelyn hadn't seen in years. It sat on her kitchen counter for nearly a full day before she opened it, not out of fear but because some decisions deserve stillness before response. The letter was from a federal agency she hadn't spoken to since the last time she turned down their invitation to re-enter public service. This time, though, the tone was different. Less formal, more measured. An acknowledgement, not a request. Inside was a single-page statement written in plain language, signed by someone who once called her ma'am in a secured room with no windows. "What you did at that station showed us more than any policy draft or audit," could it read. "We saw the cracks, and now we have no choice but to reckon with them. You reminded the system that silence is a form of record, too. Evelyn folded the page once, then again, and slipped it into the back of her journal. Not for display, not for proof, just for memory. That evening she sat on the porch with her coat wrapped tight the air, carrying the scent of burning leaves and distant fireplaces. The street was quiet, but not silent, just alive in the soft way neighborhoods get when people are home and safe. A radio played faint jazz through a cracked window down the block. Wind rustled through the trees like whispers moving through old stories, and Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, letting it all settle into her chest. She hadn't planned for any of this. She hadn't strategized her moment or orchestrated her resistance. All she did was sit. All she did was remain still when the world expected her to shrink. People had called her a hero, an icon, a legend. But none of those words felt honest to her. They didn't match the quiet weight of the cuffs or the ache in her wrists, or the long walk out of that terminal with a stranger at her side and history clinging to the back of her coat. Those words weren't wrong, but they were too neat, and Evelyn had always lived in the in-between. A soft knock came at the door just after dusk. She opened it to find Lisa Chen standing there. No uniform, no clipboard, just a woman in a wool sweater, hands clasped in front of her like she was still holding a question. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Lisa said, her voice low. "I just needed to say something in person." Evelyn stepped aside, nodded once, and led her to the small living room where the chairs creaked gently as they sat. Lisa didn't rush her words. She didn't rehearse them. "I didn't know who you were," she said, eyes on her hands. "But I knew you weren't wrong, and I should have said something that day." Evelyn tilted her head, thoughtful. "You did," she said quietly. "Not with your mouth, but with your eyes." Lisa blinked, surprised. "I didn't know it showed." Evelyn smiled gently. "The truth always does." They talked for nearly an hour, not about the station, not about the video, not about systems or policies. They talked about their mothers, about how silence feels different depending on what side of it you're on, about the ache that comes from being right when it costs you comfort. When Lisa finally stood to leave, Evelyn walked her to the porch. "I'm still learning how to stand up inside systems that don't want to listen," Lisa said, brushing her sleeve. "But you gave me something to start with." Evelyn touched her arm softly, steady as ever. "Then keep walking," she said, "even when it gets quiet, especially then." As Lisa disappeared down the path, the night pulled itself tighter around the house. Evelyn stood there for a long time, staring up at the stars, remembering how many nights she had spent, wondering if the work she did, quiet, relentless, invisible, had ever mattered. And now, in this strange new light, she saw that it had, not in loud change, but in shifted eyes, in open doors. The next morning, a letter to the editor appeared in the local paper, not written by Evelyn, but about her unsigned, unclaimed. It read, "She reminded us that sometimes power doesn't arrive in boots or badges. Sometimes it wears quiet coats and moves like water, slow, steady, impossible to stop." Evelyn clipped it not for ego, but for history, because there is power in remembering what almost slipped past unnoticed. And on the final page of her journal, just beneath the crease, she wrote her own ending. Not with a period, but with a line that would hold its shape long after she was gone. "I was never here to shout. I was here to witness, to withstand, to remind the world that stillness, when anchored in truth, cannot be moved by noise." And with that, Evelyn closed the book, not to forget, but to begin again. Quietly, strongly, as she always had. In a world that often rewards noise and spectacle, Evelyn Rhodes taught us that true power lives in stillness, quiet, grounded, and unwavering. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. She simply remained rooted in truth when others tried to strip her of dignity. Her story reminds us that strength isn't always loud. It's often steady, patient, and profoundly human. For those of us who've spent decades watching injustice pass quietly, by Evelyn's story is a call to remember that we still have the right to stand firm, that we don't need to explain our presence in places we belong, that our silence, when chosen, can speak louder than anger. Whether you're 70 or 17, this story is about reclaiming space, not through force, but through self-respect and clarity. So take this moment to reflect. If Evelyn's quiet courage moved you, if it reminded you of your own worth, your own history, or someone you love, please like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity never expires. And if you believe in stories that restore faith, challenge the system, and speak softly but carry truth, subscribe to our channel. Because voices like Evelyn's may be rare, but together we can make sure they're never forgotten.